Okay, let's dive in. So thanks for attending, everybody. Appreciate that. Richard Knutson here, and welcome to session 2 of a webinar series that I call Building Business with CRM. It's designed as a value add to my book, cleverly with the same name, Building Business with CRM. Website here, CRMBizBook.com for more information. Contact information here. I run the CRM practice at a Chicagoland-based Microsoft-centric IT consulting firm called Magenium, actually in beautiful Wheaton, Illinois. It's our website. And I'm a Dynamics CRM MVP for 2011 and 2012. My blog, Dynamics CRM Trick Bag, has lots of complimentary content on Dynamics CRM, business processes, and other aspects of Dynamics CRM. So, welcome to check that out. And if you like this book, the CRM Field Guide, you might want to check that out. That is a nearly 1,000-page tome that I co-authored with a number of my friends from the CRM MVP community, and you can find out more there. Let's go ahead and dive in. I guess I should say is a bit of housekeeping. I think everybody's on mute. Yeah, so what we'll do is use the Q&A queue if you have questions throughout, and I'll check it about halfway through. And then we'll leave time at the end to address any questions anybody has. And not that I don't like interacting by voice, but it does help the quality of the recordings a little bit, so we'll mute everybody during the session. Okay, so what is this webinar series? What do you expect from these sessions? Well, 90-minute sessions. They are really designed as add-ons to the book. I mentioned that. And I'll use the structure of the book to really dictate the structure of these sessions. So we'll go through essentially by chapter. And in particular, if you purchase the book at the CRMBizBook site, I'm going to talk about that in a second, give you contact information in case you didn't. But if you do, you get solutions for each chapter, and then you can import the solutions and walk through the workflows and dialogue processes that they contained. And that's what we'll do in these sessions. So we'll basically use the structure of the book to drive the sessions and then walk through those processes and related processes too. We'll look at some other things as well. These are open enrollment free. Everybody's welcome to come, but obviously you get more value out of it. They are designed as add-ons to the book. And again, if you purchase the book, say on Amazon, you don't necessarily get the solutions. So if you have the book and you didn't purchase it here, you want the solutions that go along with it, that these webinars will be driven by, you can contact Joy at this email address, jgarscadden at Colorado TC, that's Colorado Technology Consulting. The irrepressible Julie Yak, my publisher, that's her company, so Joy can hook you up with the solutions. So that's what the webinar series is about. We'll take a quick break about halfway through, save off the recording, and then move on. Now there's a number of people here who weren't in the first session, so what I do want to do is kind of step back a little bit and kind of provide a big picture of what we mean by processes in Dynamics CRM and the kinds of things you can do with them. Spend a little bit of time with that. I will review some of the content that we talked about in session 1, which is really kind of workflow fundamentals. I'm going to go through some of the more important kind of fundamental and maybe harder to understand things, help you out with that a little bit. And then I'm going to, this probably is a little bit understated, I'm going to drill down on the topics in chapter 3. We touched a little bit on that last time, but it was we covered it relatively quickly, so I really want to drill down on dynamic values and especially conditional logic flow of workflows, and really drill down on some of the more interesting examples in chapter 3. And wrap up with a little bit of a preview of the next session, which will be covering mainly focused on dialogues. So, first, what do we mean by, why do we care about Dynamics CRM processes? In the sense that I use it here in most of the content in the book, what we refer to by that, the term process, is really workflow and dialogue processes. It's the kinds of process you can create using the designer in Dynamics CRM 2011. You know, workflows run in the background. Dialogues require user input, but so what? What can you do with them? You know, what's the point of these things? Well, processes do things. Probably sounds tautological, but they do things that otherwise would have to be done by users. They can create or update records, send emails, assign records, change status, and so forth. Now, most of the actions users can perform interactively can also be done by these processes. So one obvious advantage of that is just simply can save you time. But maybe more important is the ability to enforce the same version of a sales or a service process so you can make your important business processes more repeatable. Now, another thing they can do, and I'll show you some examples of this today, it's maybe a small thing, but it can be useful, is attach job aids to records as part of a process. For example, attach the appropriate reference story to an opportunity so the sales rep doesn't have to hunt around for it, or the right knowledge base article to a case. Importantly, actions that can be performed by processes can be embedded in conditional logic so that you have the appropriate actions triggered by events. So you think of event-driven processing. We'll see some examples of that today. Together, you can think of these actions as the work and the logic as providing the flow. We'll see how these are expressed in a pretty concrete way inside the process designer. So here's one way we can categorize processes. I sort of think of utility processes, kinds of things I'm referring to, as these are time savers, but not really business processes per se. Batch record updates, data cleanup, copying records, maybe using dialog processes to substitute for a more complicated CRM form data entry experience. So I think of utility processes, and then you have the kind of the standard, the real business process per se, right? And lots of different examples. This is not an exhaustive list, of course, but assignment, notification, routing processes, autoresponders, the emails that you received with the information for the webinar. And that's an autoresponder that leveraged ClickDimension's email template to send that information out. Take a look at that. You might think of a gated process, sales process that requires certain things to be done before progressing from one stage to the next. See examples of that. Sales, service, you know, any CRM-centric business lines, so the whole XRM thing, obviously nothing specific about business processes to sales or service scenario. So whatever scenario you've customized in Dynamics CRM, you can accommodate that in processes. Now, what let's do here is compare some alternative approaches. So workflows, and we'll focus on workflows mainly today. Most of the things that we'll do, conditional logic, dynamic values, are identical between workflows and dialog processes. So just for the sake of expediency here, I'll focus primarily on workflows. Sometimes the same job could be done different ways. And so what I want to do here is contrast what you might do. So if you think about workflows, the first column is going to be who typically does these things. So workflows are going to be what? Typically done by power users, say, in the process designer. Whereas form script, that's typically, you know, created by somebody like a web developer, right? JScript to do things with a form. Whereas plugins, that's going to be compiled .NET assemblies created typically in Visual Studio, and it's, you know, the province of your professional developer types. How they get triggered, the second column here, workflows get triggered by database updates, whereas form script, JavaScript, that's triggered by form UI events. Plugins can be triggered by platform events, and you have a richer set of basically a more comprehensive event model for plugins certainly than you do for workflows. We'll look at this in a little bit. There's basically 5 actions that can trigger a workflow, but plugins much more comprehensive than that. How do they run, synchronously or asynchronously? Well, workflows are asynchronous. They run in the background and they take a few seconds to complete. Form script is synchronous, and plugins can be either. So here's a few scenarios where it might be clear. Sometimes it's clear when you have an alternative which approach to use. So think of this distinction between workflows and form script. Workflows get triggered by database updates, whereas form script is really triggered by a form UI event. So what that means, if something needs to happen, no matter how a record is created, that is if it's created maybe without a form, then you got to use a workflow to manage that. I'll show you an example of that next. On the other hand, here's a scenario where you probably want to use form script. If you need something to happen in real time so that the user can see it, for example, you select the value of the sales stage on the opportunity form and you want to conditionally display the correct section with information for that stage. So that's a scenario where you're going to use JavaScript, form script to do that. Another way to contrast, another scenario, and this sheds light on an important and maybe an easy to overlook point about CRM workflows, is CRM workflows are CRM only for the most part. You can send emails to outsiders, but you wouldn't use the built-in tools in the process designer to interact with your back-end ERP system or something like that. Whereas plugins, compiled.NET assemblies, could communicate with something outside of CRM. Maybe, automatically create a document library in SharePoint for a certain record or something like that. That would be the sort of thing you do with a plugin. So there's a few ways you can contrast those. Now, what I want to do here is let's review some of the more important things having to do with kind of workflow properties. So let's contrast automatic versus on-demand workflows. So automatic workflows are triggered even if a user never interacts with the form. And I'm going to show you a scenario here. That's an important point. And again, it's easy to miss that. If you write form script that runs when a form loads, well, there's lots of ways records can be created without loading the forms. So here's 3 scenarios. And this is just off the top of my head, but it's surprisingly common. So records can be promoted from the Outlook client. Promote contact records from the Outlook client. Form never runs. Form never opens in Dynamics CRM, but you can certainly have a workflow be triggered by that. And there's a few things that you need to be aware of in order to take advantage of kind of the options that you have there. Record can be created by a workflow. In that case, the form doesn't run. So in that case, JavaScript won't get it done for you. How about when a record is created by a web form or some other external application? Lead capture, lead to CRM. Well, the form never opens in CRM, but the record's there. So if you want to have some sort of an autoresponder, then a workflow would be a good option for that sort of thing. Now, the scope property only matters for automatic workflows, and it's easy to miss that. But what the scope property determines is which users will trigger an automatic workflow. So we're going to take a look at that. In particular, a couple of things about automatic workflows to drill down a little bit more. It's important to keep in mind that they run in the security context of the owner of the workflow. Workflows are user-owned records, just like other records, and the owner has implications for who's going to trigger those automatic workflows. And the workflows are the rule for who is going to trigger. Suppose you got a workflow that runs on the create event of an opportunity record. Well, it depends on the scope of the workflow and the business unit of the workflow owner compared to the user that we're interested in whether or not they'll trigger the workflow. And I'm going to show you an example that sheds some light on that. So here's an example, something maybe here's a gated sales process workflow. And since I've got one of these checkboxes checked here in the start when section, that defines this really as this is an automatic workflow. If none of these things are checked, then it's not an automatic workflow, and none of these things over here matter. But in this case, since it's automatic, notice scope is set to organization. This workflow is going to run no matter who in the organization creates an opportunity record. But we'll see there are plenty of other ways of triggering these workflows as well. And here, so just contrasting, this is the general tab of that workflow, and here's the administration tab. It's easy to get in the habit of ignoring this if you don't. You may, in a lot of smaller organizations, there may only be one or two people in the organization that actually create workflows. So this might not seem as important as for other record types, but it is. If you want to target workflows, you need to pay attention to that. I'll show you an example of how to get that to work. So in demo number 1, this is kind of the review and some of the fundamentals. I'm going to show you a couple of things. I'm going to promote a contact record from the Outlook client. May be obvious, but the CRM form doesn't appear. but you can still have an automatic workflow be triggered by that. And then the question is, what might that workflow do? Well, one of the things workflows often do is to set default values. So for example, suppose I get an email from somebody that's not a contact, in CRM that is, and I want to turn him into a contact and add him to my email newsletter distribution list. What we can do, if we know how the Outlook fields map to CRM fields, you can have conditional logic on a workflow that runs when a contact is created do something like that. And this is kind of an interesting thing because if you think about it, you know, how do those? There's lots of fields on an Outlook contact form that aren't in CRM. There's lots that are, but it's not always going to be as obvious as first name in Outlook mapping to first name in the CRM contact form. And there's a pretty good reference here. I'll show you that in a minute. That's what that tells you, is how all the Outlook fields on the contact map to CRM contacts. So triggering automatic workflows. Show you a couple of things that illustrate this. We're going to have two automatic workflows. There's going to be an opportunity workflow, a sales process that's owned by the system administrator who happens to be in the root business unit, and the trigger is the record is created, so it's going to run automatically. So the question is, when a user's in a child business unit, if they create a new opportunity record, will it trigger the workflow? It depends. It depends on the scope of the workflow. I'll show you two examples of that going kind of both ways.